All right, you guys, here I am back at it again with another PowerPoint presentation for y'all. So today we're going to start out. I'm not sure exactly what the rest of the parts of this PowerPoint is. It's been a minute since I've looked at this PowerPoint. But first off, we are going to start with the civil rights movement, which again is a huge part of the Cold War. Like I said in the last video, if y'all watched that video, it is a huge spanning time. So like the Cold War is kind of like a blanket statement, but it has a bunch of these small little events mixed in there. Okay. So right now we're going to start with the civil rights movement. Okay. Civil rights has to do with the treatment of African Americans in the United States during the about mid 20th century, mid 20th century. So it's the mid 1900s, 1950s, 1960s, pretty much any time from 1865 after the end of the Civil War all the way up till about 1965. That kind of period is what we're looking at. African Americans were treated like second class citizens throughout the United States. They were forced to live in segregated housing, attend segregated movies, and use segregated facilities such as restrooms, water fountains, and waiting rooms. Okay, so this is segregation. I'm sure you guys have heard of segregation before, but basically, in simple terms, that just means that every single thing that you could possibly think of is separate. They have separate housing. They ride different sections of the bus. If you guys have heard of, Rosa Parks, African American people were only allowed to sit in the back of the bus. They had to go to different schools. They had to use different restaurants, different water fountains, sit in different parts of restaurants. They had to sit in different parts of the movie theater or a play theater or whatever. Anything that you can think of was completely separated. Okay, so that's what segregated means. It's basically a fancy word for separate. Okay, so during the civil rights movement, African Americans fought against racial discrimination and segregation. So it is during this time, about the 50s, 60s especially, that African Americans are starting to stand up against their white oppressors. Okay, they are fighting against this discrimination, against this segregation. They're kind of saying, look, we are the same as you. We should have the same rights as you. We should have the same treatment as you. We should be able to go to the same bathroom as you. We should be able to eat where you eat and live in the same types of houses you do. This kind of isn't fair, right? So this is kind of what this whole period is about. And like you can see both sides of this argument, right? So over here, I'm not exactly sure what state this is in, but in this picture, we have whites protesting racial integration. What racial integration is basically you take different races and you mix them all together. There's no separation at all. Okay, so it's like this sign says race mixing is communism. Stop the race mixing. March of the something. I can't read the rest of it. And there's another race mixing is communism type thing. Okay, so these are white people that's processing it. This is a African American gentleman that's just holding a simple sign, which honestly I love. It's just, I am a man. Okay, he's not black. He's not African American. He's not a boy. He's a man. Okay, he's just like anybody else. He's just like any of these white men over here. He's just here trying to get equal treatment. Okay, so this is kind of the stuff that we're talking about. Schools, especially, are a huge thing. Schools were another place where blacks and whites were segregated. In 1954, Oliver Brown sued the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, because the schools were segregated. This, you guys, is one of the most famous, and I'm not even kidding, one of the most famous Supreme Court cases in United States history. Okay, Brown versus Board of Education is one of the most famous. It is a huge, huge deal. Okay, so this guy goes into the Supreme Court. He sues the Board of Education and says, schools should not be segregated. Okay. He is saying his 3rd grade daughter, Linda, had to travel 1 mile to get to her black school, even though the white school was so much closer. So she had to travel a huge distance in order to get to school when there was a white school right next door or right down the street. She had to walk all that way to try and get to their quote black school. But the white school is right there. So why can't he's kind of saying, why can't my daughter attend this school? Give me one good reason why she can't attend this school. And really, the only reason that the South or Kansas had is the fact that she was African American. Okay. Okay, so in this map, this is showing educational segregation in the U.S. prior to Brown versus Board of Education. Okay, so in the South, in these red states, educational segregation was required. Okay, so that means that every state in this area were required to separate African Americans and whites when they went to school. Okay. In the yellow, that means there's no legislation. That means you could have them segregated, you could have them not segregated. They're not necessarily telling you either way. The blue these are optional states. They can do it, they cannot. And then the green are forbidden. You cannot have segregation whatsoever in the educational system. So the green states are all mixing together. You can have blacks and whites in the same school. Okay. Okay, so this is pictures of Linda Brown having to walk all this way just to get to her school where she was made to go because of segregation. Okay. Which, I mean, some people might be like, oh, why is it a problem? Because, she's still going to school and she's still getting educated and blah, blah, blah. Well, what you guys need to understand is not only one, is it you kind of have to force her to go through these hardships because she has to walk to and from school a mile every single day. Would you guys want to walk a mile to school every single day? I know some of you probably wouldn't want to do that. But not only on top of that, it was very typical that African American schools were very poor. Okay, they didn't have very good resources. Their teachers might not have all the greatest resources, might not have the greatest educations. They're not getting paid very well. So sometimes they don't really care about the kids, which is really sad. It's just not a great place. So if you're a kid and you guys might look at it differently because you guys may not like school, but when you're a kid in this day and age and you really, really want to learn, but you're restricted to only being in one little place or one little box, it can kind of suck. It's not really fair if you want something better, right? Okay, so now we get to Thurgood Marshall. Okay, Linda Brown's lawyer was Thurgood Marshall. Okay, he argued the case before the United States Supreme Court that having separate schools violated the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Okay, 14th Amendment is what gave African Americans their freedoms after the Civil War. Okay, it's basically they're saying you can be citizens, you have these rights. Okay. This is a photograph of Thurgood Marshall. In 1967, he became the first African American Supreme Court justice. Okay, so he is making strides for African Americans and he's defending Linda Brown and saying she should be able to go to this white school. Even though it's segregated and even though this is a white school, she should be able to go there. Okay. Okay, so the Brown versus Board of Education, we're going to break it down a little bit. So the United States Supreme Court heard the case Brown versus Board of Education. In 1954, they ruled that students could no longer be segregated. So they completely ruled out segregation, period. Okay, the court said segregation was illegal and public schools across America began to integrate because of this. So the United States Supreme Court finally said that at least in schools, public schools have to integrate. It is illegal for you to segregate and to discriminate upon your public students. Okay. All right, so this is a couple pictures of that. It says court bans segregation in public school cases in this newspaper. And down here in this photograph, you can see black and white children kind of playing and getting along and stuff like that. All right, so now this is one of the most famous pictures or I guess events or days in the civil rights movement and in American history. Okay, the National Guard escorts 9 African American students to their high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. So after the Supreme Court ruling that you could no longer segregate schools, that meant that black students were now able to go to the same school as white students. Okay, and as you can imagine, especially in the South, that did not go over too hot. Okay, so in Little Rock, Arkansas, there were 9 black students that were going to this white school, or what used to be a primarily white school. Because of the fact that the local government and the students and their parents and a lot of other people, the government, were scared that these students would get harmed, they enlisted the National Guard to protect these students when walking into the building, when changing classes. Basically, they escorted them throughout their entire day to protect them from getting hurt. Okay? Because if you guys remember in these times, or I want you guys to understand about these times, is African Americans were treated very, very badly. Okay? There were times where they would get beaten, they would get jumped, they would get names called, completely mistreated. Some of them would even get killed. Even up to this time, in the 50s, African Americans were still getting strung up and hung in trees and stuff like that, just on the basis of the fact that they're African American. So this is not a real safe environment for these people to kind of be in. And that what really is pushing all these changes. Okay, so now we've got one of the most famous activists in the civil rights movement, and it's Rosa Parks. Okay, the cojones on this woman baffles me. Okay, in 1955, an African American woman named Rosa Parks helped start the modern civil rights movement. So after a long day of work, Parks refused to give up her seat on a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama, to a white person. So, like I said, on bus systems, African American person could get on the bus and sit in different seats. But if a white person got on and wanted them to move, they were expected to move. Or if anything, they were made to sit in the back of the bus. It was always, you have to go to the back of the bus. Okay? Well, Rosa gets a seat, and she's had a long day at work, long, hard day at work, and she refuses to leave when this white person comes up and tells her to move. Now, because of the fact that she didn't give up her seat on a bus, imagine this, she didn't give up her seat on a bus, so she was arrested. She was arrested and sent to jail because she didn't give up her seat. Okay? And her actions set off a ton of different protests. Okay? So if this is a picture right here of Rosa Parks over here, and then this is her riding a bus, okay, in protest. Okay, so now we've got the Montgomery bus boycott. So remember, you guys, boycott is when you refuse to use something, or you refuse to buy something, or whatever, to make a point. Okay, so Martin Luther King Jr. led the protests, and he urged people to boycott the buses. So he is telling them, do not use the buses. Don't pay for the buses. Don't get on them. Walk to work, try and get a car, whatever. Don't use the buses. Completely protest the buses. Okay. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted for a year, and the bus company lost a huge amount of money because people who are using the bus to get to work every single day aren't using it anymore. So the bus company is losing a lot of money. Okay, the US Supreme Court eventually outlawed segregation of all public transportation in the city. Because of this bus boycott and all of the issues and protests that were coming up because of it, the United States Supreme Court finally says, okay, we've gotten rid of segregation in schools. Why not public transportation too? I mean, that should be equal also. And this will get rid of these issues, right? So that meant that if Rosa Parks got on a bus and she wanted to sit in the front seat, she could, theoretically. Okay. This picture of empty buses, and then these are women who are walking to work and boycotting the buses. And I think these are some men back here too. But these are boycotters who are walking to work because they refuse to get on the buses. Okay, so now we've got Martin Luther King Jr., which I know you guys know. He's a famous man. I know you guys know we get a day off of school because of him, but I wonder how much you guys actually do know sincerely about what his impact on the United States was. Okay? As a result of the bus boycott, Martin Luther King Jr. became known across the nation as the leader of the civil rights movement. Okay? King preached nonviolent civil disobedience against unfair laws. Basically, what that means is, it doesn't mean you go out and fire a gun off or set off bombs or even go up and punch somebody in the face or anything like that to get your point across. What he's saying is have sit-ins. Just sit there and refuse to move, or boycott buses, refuse to pay money for these buses. Don't go to certain things, boycott it. Don't do these certain things. You can go on marches, stand up against these unfair laws that you have problems with, but don't do it violently. Nonviolent civil disobedience speaks so much more words than violent protests. Because if you violently protest, then people will look at your cause as, oh, these are rebels, these are anarchists, these are, crazy people who are trying to be violent and they're monsters and blah, blah, blah. But if they're nonviolent, and especially if the other side turns violent on them when the African Americans did nothing in the first place, that's going to speak many, many, many more words, and it's going to get a lot more things changed. Okay? So he believed that African Americans could gain their rights by protesting, but that the protests should be peaceful, as I said. Okay, so these are a couple pictures of Martin Luther King Jr. himself. All right, so nonviolent protests. We're going to talk about some of this. African Americans and some whites held nonviolent marches and boycotts across the country. So I want you guys to understand this also. So it's not all whites that are bad during this time. There are a lot of whites that are coming along and fighting for African American civil rights alongside the African Americans. There are a lot of people who are advocating, a lot of whites that are advocating for these African Americans and saying, we need to better ourselves. We need to fix this. This needs to be better. We need to make this work. We need to make this fair. There are a lot of people protesting and being a part of these marches. At times, the nonviolent actions from civil rights workers received violent reactions from white people. Some protesters were beaten, shot at, and even killed. Okay? Remember when I said if the other side turns on you, it's going to speak a lot louder words. This happened a lot. African Americans would just be having a sit-in, would refuse to move, like Rosa Parks did. Or they would be having these marches or anything like that. And whites would get so angry that they would beat them up. They would shoot at them. They would string them up and hang them on trees. They would mutilate their bodies, stuff like that. Terrible, terrifying things would happen. And it was the white people who were doing it. So it's horrible, but the nonviolent protests actually kind of started working in the African Americans' favors. Okay, so if you can see this, In this, the protesters are getting arrested because they were protesting. In this, these African American women are refusing to move at a lunch counter. They're sitting where they're not supposed to be sitting, and this white gentleman is going to pour, it looks like, either water or some type of pop or soda on this woman just because she's sitting here. All of these people are harassing these women just because she's sitting here or they're sitting here. Okay, we've got a police dog attacking this guy and ripping his pants off. Here we've got a fire hose being sprayed at these people. I don't know if you guys have ever felt the pressure from a fire hose or seen how high fire hoses can spray or anything like that, but trust me when I say they have a lot of pressure in them. And if you ever been in a shower that has a lot of pressure, like way too much pressure, you can tell it kind of hurts your skin a little bit, or it feels like kind of painful. This is a ton of pressure. Okay, all these people are being sprayed with water, so you'd think, oh, like, it's water, it won't really hurt. No, this is hugely pressurized water, so this hurts a lot. Okay, this is happening just because they're having a peaceful march or a peaceful protest. All right, so now we've got the biggest march in history. So we've got the March on Washington. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. led more than 250,000 people on a civil rights march in Washington, D.C. They called on President Kennedy and Congress to pass a law that guaranteed equal rights and quality education, for all citizens. And this is when King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech at the gathering. Okay, and it's also, this is part of Forrest Gump. If you guys have ever seen the Forrest Gump movie, Forrest Gump actually ends up speaking at the March on Washington. It is a famous moment in American history. And this is what staples Martin Luther King Jr.'s, presence in American history with I Have a Dream speech. Okay. Here are just some pictures from the March on Washington. This whole space, all of this is all people that had come to protest on Washington and get things changed. Okay. Okay, so this is the first part of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech. He says, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." And that is an extremely powerful statement. That left ripples throughout the entire country of change, of just, I don't know, it's hard to explain. It just changed things. From that moment on, everything was different. Okay, the Civil Rights Act. The March on Washington got the government's attention, and Congress soon passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. This law banned discrimination against any American because of that person's race, color, or religion. Okay, so that now anybody who lives in the United States is protected. It doesn't matter if they're black, white, purple, yellow, brown, whatever color you want. It doesn't matter what race you are, what color you are, if you are Christian, if you're Catholic, if you're Muslim, whatever, you are protected. You cannot be discriminated against. If you are an American, it does not matter where you come from, what type of person you are protected under this law. Okay, the law enforced the desegregation of public places, and it also said that people of all races, male and female, should have the equal opportunity to get a job. Okay, so this is not only talking about races and religion, this is also talking about gender, which was a huge thing at this time. Okay, this is actually leads to this female movement. Okay, speaking up for female rights. Okay, so now we've got the Voting Rights Act. So even though the 15th and 19th Amendments had given African American men and women the right to vote, there were still voting problems in the South. Okay, so many states still used literacy tests to keep people from voting. Basically what that means is if you could read, if you could pass this literacy test, which is literacy is how well you can read. If you can pass this test, then you can get the right to vote. But if you can't pass this literacy test, then you have no right to vote. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned all literacy tests. So they made it so as soon as you turn 18, if you are 18 and you register to vote, you have the right to vote. It's not you have to jump through all these different hoops and everything like that, and specifically singling out those African Americans that may not have gotten an education or may not have gotten a really good education, or they may have some type of learning disability or something like that where they can't read as well. Doesn't mean they're not stupid, or doesn't mean that they are stupid, excuse me. Doesn't mean they're stupid. It's just they can't read so hot. And because of that, the South, a lot of southern states were banning them from voting. So the Voting Rights Act completely put an end to that and made sure that anybody can vote. This picture is President Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King Jr. at the signing of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So now at this point in 1965, JFK had already been shot and killed, and Lyndon B. Johnson is the one who takes his place because that was his vice president. So he takes over as president of the United States. All right, so now I'll try and fly through this section really quickly. This is going to be assassinations in America. Okay, so the 1960s were a time period of great change in America. Many people did not like the civil rights legislation, and they disagreed with powerful political leaders at the time. The assassinations of 3 important leaders during the 1960s made a lasting impact on American society. The first is John F. Kennedy. President John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. He was riding in a convertible Lincoln with the top down during a parade. Lee Harvey Oswald was charged with shooting President Kennedy from a building across the street. Many Americans mourned the loss of Kennedy as he had been a very popular president. President Kennedy is probably one of the most famous and popular presidents in American history. This is devastating for Americans during this time. Lee Harvey Oswald was actually in a book factory, or like some type of a book business where there was multiple stories or levels in the building. So he is across the street. He shoots him. He fires 2 shots. And this is why there's a lot of discrepancy and conspiracy theorists with John F. Kennedy's death. Lee Harvey Oswald fires 2 shots. The first goes into Kennedy's neck, and that's kind of when he's like, oh crap, what the heck's going on? Goes into his neck. The second shot goes into the side of his head, and that's when he dies, basically. He is thought to be still alive, or they're trying to rush him to the hospital. This is the part that gets me. They rush him to the hospital. The workers and nurses, doctors, whatever you call them, in the emergency room give President Kennedy CPR for 25 minutes before they actually announce him dead for a gunshot to the head. Okay, I'm just going to say it again. A gunshot to the head. They gave him CPR for 25 minutes. The reason is nobody wants to have the job of announcing that the president was just killed. That's basically what that was. But in that moment, the United States president was all of a sudden dead. And literally that night, Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as president of the United States. So that was kind of a crazy day. So these are some photographs from the parade. This is right before he was shot and killed. Okay. You can see, obviously, he's in a convertible. It was easy access for Lee Harvey Oswald. And it just kind of all goes down from here. Okay, the second one is Martin Luther King Jr. So on April 5th, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot while he was standing on a hotel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee. Many people were furious, and riots broke out all across the country. His death did not stop the civil rights movement, though. Today, the fight to achieve equal civil rights for all Americans still goes on. Okay, so this was a big deal for African Americans, especially to see that Martin Luther King Jr. had died. Kind of defeated a lot of them, but in some of them, in most of them, it gave them a purpose. It pushed them to go out and fight more, to keep protesting, to get what they wanted. Okay, to keep the movement going. In this photograph, the Lorraine Hotel, where King was assassinated, is now the site of the National Civil Rights Museum. Okay, so where this wreath is, right here, this is basically the balcony or the exact spot where Martin Luther King was standing and was then shot and killed. Okay, so now we've got Robert Kennedy, or better known as Bobby Kennedy. This is JFK's little brother. He was Attorney General while JFK was president. Okay, this is another assassination that occurred in 1968. Bobby Kennedy was shot at a hotel in Los Angeles, California on June 5th. He was the younger brother of President Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy was running for the Democratic nomination for president. So a lot of people think that that's why he was assassinated, is that nobody wanted another Kennedy in office. Whether they thought that more civil rights acts would be passed, or they just disagreed with the Kennedy family, or what have you. Okay, so basically 2 Kennedys were shot and killed. The Kennedys is a fascinating thing. I could probably have an entire class just based off of the Kennedys. It's a fascinating family, and the history that they went through is insane. So there's, I think, 7 kids total. 2 of them, JFK and Bobby, both get shot. 1 dies in a helicopter crash. Another gets killed in World War II as a famous soldier. His plane exploded, so he died. Another one, her father forces her to get a lobotomy at home, causes her to go psycho, and they move her into an insane asylum and leave her there for 40 plus years and don't have any contact with her at all, and she ends up dying of old age and like psychoness in the early 2000s, I think. Another one, Jackie Kennedy died of cancer. John F. Kennedy Jr. died in a helicopter crash, I think. It's just a whole lot of just bad things happen in that family. It's insane the amount of death that is in that family, to be honest. So this is a picture of Bobby Kennedy speaking in front of a crowd at a civil rights rally in 1963. He was a big pushing factor for the civil rights. As Attorney General, he was one that was speaking most for civil rights and pushing these cases through the Supreme Court. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to go ahead and stop this PowerPoint here. This will be the next section that we talk about when I come back. And I will see you guys in the next video.